Good morning, everyone.
Oh, that's it? Good morning, Mike. How are you?
Sorry.
It's usually a little bit more after good morning.
I should probably use a little bit more than good morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Explicit Measures podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. I've been doing so good on the intros, and all of a sudden, it just fell out.
Can't win them all.
Can't win them. You know, Tommy was buttoning his shirt. It distracted me. I don't know what's going on. We're still getting ready for the morning. I need a little bit more coffee. Good.
Oh, that's funny.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are things going? Any good intros, conversational pieces today?
I noticed yesterday there was a late tweet that I picked up where they just released the roadmap for 2022.
Yeah.
Yes.
I didn't get time to dig into it.
There's a couple items in there that are worth noting.
I do see a natural language DAX release.
Oh boy.
In 2 months.
Yeah.
2
months.
I'm gonna hold my breath here on this one.
March or April?
I'm gonna probably say April. I'm guessing it's gonna be delayed.
They're always delayed. Yeah.
I had a thought this morning because I'm really looking forward to that feature. But you're playing with fire when you are releasing that in April. Just telling you, right? Because it better not be the April Fool's joke.
Oh man. Oh man.
A full year. April Fool's.
Yeah.
That's good. That's a good one.
So we'll see. I think we could talk more about that on Tuesday after we digest it a little bit. But if listeners are listening today, right, it's a good vision into what releases are coming when. There's some preview things that they embed into there.
Yep.
So if you're keen on new features that are coming in, it's a great place to get a head start.
I'll try and snag the link here and drop that into the chat window, and then that way people can see it. There's a couple interesting ones that are out there that are, I think, fairly relevant. Oh, the big news is something that we didn't know. We're goofballs. We should talk about this right away. Tommy did a great presentation on Tuesday around using goals in Power BI. We would be remiss if we didn't, while on the podcast, while on the session, we start talking about, well, is it premium only? Let's go look at premium. And so here we are. And so someone on the chat is like, hey, I just went into my pro account and I was like, hey, I just made a goal without being in premium. And we're like, wait a minute, what? We thought all goals was premium. Then Seth goes out and scours some documentation. He goes, yeah, it seems like there's some conflicting information. There's 2 websites for it. One says pro only. The other says pro with a mandatory premium. And we're like, wait, what gives? So I actually went out yesterday and talked to the program manager for that at Microsoft. I was like, well, dude, what gives? Is this a pro feature? He goes, yes. As of Ignite, it was a pro only feature.
As of Ignite?
As of Ignite. I didn't even know. I'm looking. I was like, "Where's the blog for this?" So we caught something before the blog came out, and we were just testing it. Happened to be testing it, so it happened around Ignite time frame. Apparently, it was going to be released. The bits got released faster than they could get the blog out. Apparently, and so now it's officially a pro only feature. So you heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen.
Nice job.
We stumbled into a new feature.
We are the first ones to update for one.
So the weird thing about that was, right, goals, they had already updated the documentation to say pro.
Yes. But
where do you use goals? It's in scorecards.
Yes.
Right? So when we looked at scorecards, it's like, this is a
premium only feature.
I'm like, well, how can that be?
We're so confused.
So that's cool.
Well,
thanks for sorting that out officially.
Like our draft. Like, I can use apps, but I don't have a workspace.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So now there's no reason now not to try goals, and they keep coming out. They are gonna. Well, I think there are a few things on the roadmap too. So
Treb from another MVP, from Marquee Insights, was actually on the call with us afterwards. Did the after hours kind of piece of this, and Treb gave us kind of just a teaser of something that he's working on with many of his clients. He works apparently with a lot of large healthcare companies, and goals may work out well for them. And as large healthcare companies, you have a lot of people to manage, regions, locations, whatever you want to, they're big companies, and they're very interested in goals. And this is, okay, after Tommy's presentation, after seeing some real examples, I'm really thinking, okay, where can I apply these? How can I remove? And what Treb was explaining was he's removing this concept of every week I do a PowerPoint slide that PowerPoint slide kind of shows you some key indicators about what your team is trying to deliver. So he's encouraging these companies, and at the executive level, they love goals because they can go to this one page and they can have comments, and you can check in things, and you can check in data points, and you can track things by quarter. What is your financial goals for a quarter? What is your people goals? What is your project goals? And kind of track everything around a centralized place. So I've got to put some more thought into this. This is, 2022. A lot of companies are just starting this up. I think it's very timely that goals are in pro. And oh yeah, Greg is noting here OKRs. I didn't know what this was, and I'm not going to attempt to understand the acronym for that. But go Google OKR metrics.
Objective and key results.
Key results. There you go. So OKRs are a method by which you can track your progress. Are you tracking towards what you want to be delivering on? So really good conversation. If you missed out on Tuesday's Power BI user group, go ahead, hit it up on YouTube. I'll actually go try and grab the link here in a little bit, and we'll put it in the chat as well, just in case you weren't there. But I'm pretty sure all the guys who are here in the chat now were actually there on Tuesday night. All three of you, thank you very much.
So Greg did ask, did OKRs drive goals in Power BI? I'm not sure. I don't know if Microsoft planned it around OKRs, but I love the alignment of it. I think if you have not read Measure What Matters, and it's just by the guy who was a venture capitalist in Google, he worked at Dell back when
not Dell. It was another one.
Not a Dell.
No, not a Dell. He didn't work at Dell. He worked at another company. It wasn't Dell. It was like Intel or something like that.
No, it was Dell.
You sure?
Oh no, it was Intel.
I think it was something else.
Look at one of them.
Let's fight about the no-named guy
that we can't remember.
I think it was McDonald's.
No. Well, maybe later. I haven't got there yet. So
doesn't he make hamburgers?
But anyways, the idea, I'm reading the book and I'm like getting inspired because like, oh, how could you apply this in different ways? And then just kind of line that with goals. I just had a scoping call with a client yesterday that they're going through all these metrics, and we just started talking about goals. But then I showed them the scorecard. It wasn't like, here, we need to fit everything you're doing based on the technical, features available. Mm-hmm. We said, okay, how can we align this? And I said, here's a good example. And I showed them just an example scorecard kind of thing. It's like, this could be a starting point because it was marketing and they had like 25 metrics. It's like, all right, we're gonna
dial that back a little.
Yeah.
Let's pick 5.
Yeah. So
cool. And that was another point that I think someone brought up and this is another good point here. For goals, it's very easy to mock up a scorecard because you don't have to bind data to an actual report yet. So you can kind of scrub out, meaning like I can make a higher level goal and then I can make sub goals to that event. And then you can kind of say, okay, well, we think our goal should be this. And you can kind of mock up some data so you can kind of see what it looks like representatively. And then show that to someone and say, okay, here we go. At a high level, in a couple minutes, I'm able to, add a couple of things here. And then you can start seeding goals. My biggest downfall here, it really goes back to...
Which is mine too. I already know what it is.
Tommy knows where I'm going with this one. And Seth knows it too, because I was chatting with Seth while Tommy was talking. I'm like, man, there's a lot of clicking going on here. There's so many clicks to get a goal going. Yeah. So my thing was like, it looks like a table, realistically, right? You have a goal. I have some numbers. I have like the goal range kind of stuff. It'd be really nice to have like a template or some kind of, load from Excel thing where I could
paste or
copy anything. Like, so I feel like, and Trev was saying the same thing in his example, right? He was doing a lot of Q1 goals that they were going to track. And then you would be like, well, I need to make all the same goals for Q2, just change the name. So that was another kind of like, oh, we're getting close. But so keep your eyes on it. I think there's going to be some more changes. My understanding is Microsoft's investing a lot in the goals thing. I think people are enjoying them. So I'm going to have to, eat my words and get on the bandwagon here and start making some goals.
I love those phrases coming out of your mouth. Tommy, well done.
Well done, Tommy.
Converted Michael, brought him onto the bandwagon.
Well, it was an enhancement. They've been enhancing it too, as well as Tommy's done a great presentation on it. It was kind of a lot of things.
Everything I shared was already available.
I'm going to give Tommy like 80% credit here. Microsoft did make the tool and is making it better, as well as they're making deployment pipelines better. There was an
I
announcement too
know.
recently around
I know.
making that better too. So
You're up in February.
I know. I got to get my deployment pipeline stuff figured out here pretty soon.
Yeah.
What am I going to present on?
PowerPoint.
Awesome. So let's transition over to the actual topic of the day. Today's topic is going to be around, we're going to talk about a feature today. And this is a feature that let's say, I'll be talking here a little bit about potentially with the deployment pipelines, because this is something that goes along with this. But today's topic is really going to be around incremental refresh. And this is a feature that it's been out for quite a while, but I don't think I've ever taken a deep dive on how to get incremental refresh working until I had a model that was just angry at me. And it was just going to fight me tooth and nail to get refreshed. And so I needed to employ incremental refresh on it. And I took a deep dive on it, figuring out how it works, what is happening in the server side. So let's just start with what is it? What is incremental refresh? And Tommy and Seth, do you guys use it? I'm gonna kick it over here to Seth. I usually start with Tommy because I read left to right, and Tommy's in the middle. He's next to me, so I'm gonna start with Seth today. So Seth, maybe just give us a quick overview of what is incremental refresh and do you use it?
Yeah, in general, incremental refresh is a feature that allows us to speed up our refresh of certain tables within our model, right? So if we look at fact tables, which is predominantly the really large ones, typically it takes a really long time to load all of that data that you want to pull into the model from an import perspective. So incremental refresh allows us to segment out by certain time ranges, and these are called partitions, uh, the fact table, so that when we load it, we have to do it once, but your incremental refresh policy dictates when the model refreshes again, it'll only refresh that time window that you want to add the data into the model. So you have one time loaded data from a historical perspective, and then incrementally you can add in data on a daily basis, or whatever time range you've set in that incremental refresh,
Yes.
thereby really speeding up the refresh time, as well as creating less of an impact on your source systems because you're not extracting all the data all the time.
And that's huge when you start getting into many models and larger models for capacity on any of your premium stuff. So if you have premium, you don't want this thing hauling for hours and hours and hours to load massive tables. You want to kind of just load the changed or the new data into your data model.
Yeah, and there's also so yes, I use it all the time. The vast majority of our models have incremental refresh, at least on one table, if not multiple. The key there is also refresh time, right? If
Yes,
you try
true.
to
Yes.
pull hundreds of millions of records every time you're refreshing the model because you want it imported,
yes,
for performance reasons, and you have SLAs around data freshness for customers and things like that, it's really the time of this that is the value in incremental refresh, because you speed through that refresh faster.
I would totally agree with that. Totally agree. So you use it a lot of time. You have a lot of models that are using this one. Tommy, how about you? Do you have a lot of models that are running incremental refresh? Would you add anything to the definition that you felt?
Yeah, no, I think I'm glad Seth brought it because we're starting to use it, but we don't use it for every report. Like it's not part of like the required process.
Yep.
Just and that that's where I have a bunch of questions on for you guys too on the scenarios that this plays out, because we've also seen, at least I've seen, that incremental refresh fits a few scenarios, or there are scenarios that work with it that make it in a sense play nice. It's not one size fits all.
Correct.
And I know that because like the first report that or the first time that incremental refresh came out, I was like, oh great, I want to do this to my most used report, which then I then broke the report. And I guess it was also when it came out, but still the value of that. And then, I mean, part of this too is hybrid tables, right? Because
that's a new thing.
But it's kind of tied on to incremental refresh.
Yeah, we should also talk about what hybrid tables do and why they're there and what they're trying to achieve. I've done a little bit of work around how to make a So before hybrid tables were an actual feature, I was making my own hybrid tables using incremental refresh. And even still, I think I have a solution now where the hybrid table portion. Well, so let's explain hybrid tables. People who haven't heard this one, this is a very new feature that just came out. A hybrid table does kind of three things. You have an import section. So let's think about your data. So I'm going to try and explain some of the nitty gritties of incremental refresh here. When you load your data, there's an incremental refresh policy you can apply to your data set. When you set up the policy, and I think there's some confusion about what this does, and I want to explain this because I've seen some chat comments around this or other people on Twitter and stuff asking these kind of questions. You can set up how long do you want your data to be refreshed for. So let's say I'm interested in the last 3 months of data. You can actually say, keep my data imported or import the information for the last 3 months. What happens is Microsoft is able to identify 3 months is the total time period that you're interested in collecting information. So what it will do is it'll make a single, what we're going to call partitions. So if you think about a data table, you can actually partition things by the day if there's like a date column. And in incremental refresh, you're actually using a date time column to do the partitioning. So if I have a 3-month window where I want the data to be fresh, Microsoft will make, and this is the beauty of this, you could do partitions manually. You can write a partition schema with a function, and you can trigger the model to do it automatically by yourself. You can make up some weird partitions. You can name them whenever you want. But the interesting part here is Microsoft will handle this automatically using Power BI Desktop. They just automatically figure out what the incremental policy will look like. So each month, and it'll be dated by year, quarter, month, because you could actually go by, I want the last 10 quarters, I want the last 5 years, whatever the increment is, there's a naming schema that follows that. And then when you're in the certain month, in the last month, right? So let's say we're in the month of January like we are now. January is not complete. So we have days of January that's not complete. So it's not refreshing the entire partition for January. Instead, in the month of January, it'll break down everything by day. So the basically the smallest granular piece that you find in incremental refresh is a daily refresh. So 3 months of total information. The partitions for December and November of last year will be a full partition. It'll be one file, but the partitions for January will be by day. And then there's another portion of this of a incremental refresh that says how many days historically do you want to automatically refresh. So this is my example here when I talk to clients about this, it's like a snake eating time, right? So the snake eats another block of time at the beginning, and then it adds another chunk of data to the partition, and it adds one more day, and it'll eat that information. So if you set the refreshing or the refresh policy to say, I only want to grab the latest one day, what it will do is when the refresh happens, it'll grab one full day of data, and then it'll update it in the partition schema, or it'll add a new one if you have it refreshing during the day as well. So technically, if you turn on the option called only refresh full days, it'll only refresh yesterday. If you uncheck that option, it'll then refresh today's data and the full partition for yesterday. And then you can increase that number. So I could say always refresh the last 3 or 5 days. So thinking further here with this, if I have data in my source system that's kind of, we have data coming into our data system, and let's say the last 2 or 3 days, records are constantly updating. Maybe there's a little bit of, the data is not stable yet, right? You need a couple days for all the information to kind of settle into the tables. That's what this longer range of time, so you can always refresh the last 7 days. And then when you move to tomorrow, you'll still refresh the last 7 days, but that one day at the end of that snake essentially gets hardened and it doesn't change now anymore. Does that make sense when how to explain that? There's kind of the two pieces out there.
Mm-hmm. And I think, why is this game changing?
Why is this game changing?
I don't know if people understand, but Power BI is like a bull in a china shop to data sources. Like if you just handle, if you just go default, right, and you click have a scheduled refresh on a model, you are hammering source systems. Like Power BI is just like open the floodgate and pull as much data out as possible, because it's going to execute all of your queries at the same time. The only way around that is by setting the properties, right, to execute those sequentially, where it's only going to refresh each one of those Power Query connections one at a time, which is a little less abusive on your source system. But especially when you're talking about refreshing at a fast cadence, like every 30 minutes, or large volumes of data, that's why this incremental refresh is game changing, because you're not abusing the systems behind the scenes, as well as getting fresh data in a faster time.
Are these exactly right? And so I want to kind of pause that thought here just for a second. I want to go to the chat here. There's a couple questions that are kind of coming in. So one of them is, how do you see the partitions? So someone's asking about that. SQL Server Management Studio, SSMS, Mark, for you asking what that means. SSMS is SQL Server Management Studio. Oh, thank you, Joe, for catching that one. SQL Server Management Studio is a SQL tool. It's free to download. You have to get the latest version for it to work. If you're on Premium, meaning you have the XMLA endpoint. So let's talk about where Premium lives and where incremental refresh works. You can use incremental refresh, I think, chat, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe on Pro and Premium. On Pro, for incremental refresh, all the features work, but the downside is you can't see the partitions and you can't kind of go poke at the partitioning pieces behind the scenes, right? So you can do it, but you just kind of have to know it's handling what it should be handling, okay? On Premium, you have the XMLA endpoint. And for the XMLA endpoint, you're able to go into SQL Server Management Studio. You can enter the Power BI URL, securely connect to that data model, open it up, and on a table-by-table basis, you can look at the partitions that are inside that table. And so this is how I learned how to, what is the refresh policy we put in Power BI, and how does that reflect what is actually created at the back end inside the tables? So you have to kind of like turn it on and then go watch what it does, and then, I see how it's building the schema. It makes sense now. So you can play around with that. So I would highly recommend, if you have Premium, turn on incremental refresh for a table, set up a policy, and there's actually really good documentation. I don't know, Tommy or Seth, would you mind going to snag the URL for how to set up incremental refresh? There is a little bit of a trickiness that you want to do with incremental refresh. It's not about the cell. That's Alex Powers. Alex, I believe Alex is a big fan of the M language, but in order for you, Tommy there, thank you very much. In order for you to use incremental refresh, and Alex Powers will love this one, because you have to be able to have a data query source that folds. You need to have query folding. So I can't do incremental refresh on an Excel document. I can't query fold a statement back to the source of Excel to get just the latest changed records. That doesn't work. SQL Server is one of those items that does have incremental refresh. And so I'll also note here too, if you add a ton of Power Query steps, you potentially could break your query folding. And if you break your query folding, incremental refresh will not be able to go back to the source system and load all the information that you need. You need to have that working.
Is that a hard block, or is it just like,
yes,
if
it doesn't fold, it will not incremental refresh? So I was working with a data source. I was working with Google Cloud Platform, and we had a custom query inside the custom query that was inside the initial call to go to Google and to get the data from the table, and it was not foldable because I had the SQL query in there. And so what was happening, it was loading the entire table and then applying the incremental refresh onto that after I had loaded the entire table. Not helpful, right?
So don't get me wrong. Like, and I think the distinction, Alex points out my distinction. You can, but whether or not it's going to work is
true. Yes. You may. In my case, I was loading like millions of records and then then cutting it down and then dropping that little portion into a. So yes, it technically works, but it makes no sense for you to query the entirety of the table.
I'm with you there.
Yeah.
I was being that 1% guy that's like, hey, I set up incremental refresh on 100 rows and it worked.
Yes. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
I think I want to make a point to what Mike described before, though. It works in these different licenses, but anything at scale, I wouldn't want to work with incremental refresh without the advanced incremental refresh, like where I can go connect to, because the power for me when I use incremental refresh is being able to connect to that model and refresh partitions.
Okay, so that's a great point. Yeah,
on my own, right?
So explain that. What is that? Yeah, explain that.
So in Pro, essentially what you would do is you could set up incremental refresh on the model, you could deploy it, and then it's a black box, right? You don't know what's going on behind the scenes because you don't have access to the model. So in Premium, because you have that connection through Management Studio, and it behaves just like you would have an Azure Analysis Services server, right?
Yep.
Because that's what it is. They give you access to the back end of the table that you have set up for incremental refresh and everything else in the model, which is amazing. When you have to or want to only refresh one of the partitions, you can go do that manually in SSMS, right? So in many cases for us, for example, if you schedule incremental refresh and you're ingesting a bunch of data daily,
yes,
and your refresh window is today or the last 2 days, but somewhere in the line, like 4 or 5 days ago, you didn't realize that the source data got messed up somehow.
Yep.
You go fix that. If you don't have the premium, right, where you can go touch the model and go back, you'd have to reload the entire model again.
Yep.
Versus me, who just has to go through SSMS, go to that partition and refresh the day again and repair the data.
Yes.
And I think if you're going to go at scale, I would highly recommend that you do that in the premium realm.
Yep.
Because having that access to the XMLA model behind the scenes like allows you to manage that model so much better. So it's a fantastic feature, but to fully get the benefits, I think premium is something I would definitely recommend, because we use the back end of that all the time.
And that's a great point, because I think a lot of companies have change management after the fact, especially with the sales.
Oh yeah.
So that's just part of
it's going to be part of the problem. Yep.
Yeah. So, and because especially when you set up incremental refresh, the initial load takes a long time.
Yes.
So if you are working constantly on this, it's one of those that once you do set it up, or when you are going to set it up, make sure that you have all the edits that you need to go, because again, like that first load will take a very long time. Like
correct.
Yeah.
And there's tricks too. So let me explain what happens when you do this. So there's something I had to learn, and you guys confirm with me if this is your discovery as well. If you have a Power BI data model locally where you have set 1 or 2 tables up to do incremental refresh, the first time you publish the report to the service, it's not actually making the partitions. It doesn't make anything for you. So what happens is, I think, and this is my observation, it is when you first publish those data set to the service, if you go right away into SSMS and look at the partitions for those tables, you'll see there's one partition and it's named funny. It's some kind of weirdo GUID name, because what you've done is you've taken a local model that from your desktop locally does not make partitions. When you're working on that data locally on Power BI desktop, it's just one normal partition like you'd normally import a table, clean and done. Then only when you hit refresh in the service, the first time you refresh this data set, and this is something that's confusing for clients when I walk them through this, the first time you hit refresh, it says, oh, I'm going to refresh this table. I see it has an incremental refresh policy, and therefore, because I have the incremental refresh policy set up, I now need to go make partitions. So what it does is it says, I'm going to go make the partitions. The partitions are then created for your policy, either by month or by day, however you set it up. And then it goes through, and then it goes, like Seth said, it goes beast mode on your data source system. And it says it runs as many queries as it can. Each core gets a separate query, and it will run 10 queries at your source system. So it's going to try and get data out as fast as it can. So you better be prepared, because if you have a lot of big tables and a lot of data coming out, it could be running multiple queries by month to load millions of records out of your source system.
Let IT know and do it at night.
Well, so here's a tip, right? Especially for volume, if you're doing this for volumes of data, right?
Yes.
One of the things, Mike, that's interesting is, like, when I publish my model, like the data set just automatically kicks off a refresh after I've finished to publish. So it'll automatically create the partitions, I guess, behind the scenes. But yes, it needs to refresh in set. For the sources that are set up for incremental refresh, what we've done is limit the data, and whether that's by some company or product, something that spans the partitions or like limits the data set, will help that initial load go much faster, right? Because you're already going to consume a bunch of time creating partitions on the back end, but if you're only loading 1% of the data with those partitions, you're much better off, because then if you have advanced incremental refresh, then you can go in SSMS and then load those partitions to 2, 3, 4 at a time, because the volumes are going to be so high. You're gonna peg your system, like it's gonna you're gonna it's gonna take a while.
And there's timeout too, right? So if you with Seth's point too, right? Power BI will time out after a certain amount of time. This is why this is important. If you trigger this, so again, you publish the report to the service, it's going to have one partition in it. And so what Seth says is, if you hit refresh now to kind of load up the data, right? And so what Seth is talking about is, in your SQL views or in a view, you can actually cut the data to a much smaller amount. Now, what I found out is, if you have the XML endpoint and Tabular Editor 3, it probably works in 2. I haven't checked it in 2, but you can go to the table and you can say, oh shoot, I'm forgetting the name of the setting. There's something like apply incremental policy. And what that does is it applies a policy to the table. It makes the partitions, but does not load the data. And if you hit you can pre-make the partitions without loading data. So that's so I found that one to be very helpful, because what I could, to your point, Seth, exactly right. I have a table with 60 million records in it, and I need to load a lot of data over time, right? If I just hit publish and then refresh, it's going to eat all 60 million data. My SQL server was falling over in the back end because I was killing it too fast. So what I had to do instead was go publish the model, go to Tabular Editor, say make the partitions, which makes all the partitions for me, and then I could go back to SSMS and then slowly refresh the partitions like 5 at a time, because now I could take a metered approach. And Gilbert at Formu has a really good blog around, he made an Excel document that you can go use, which will then script out what you need in 3 or 4 partition increments. So basically you write out all the partitions you need to build. It will then automatically go through and build them for you, and it will do it 4 at a time. So we'll just kind of stack them up and automatically go through. It's huge.
I love how you have gone from like so much under the business straight into the enterprise.
Dude, I'm like, right? I'm all in now.
Like Tabular Editor gives you access to the tabular model that you had before, right? Where you had to manually create all these partitions in the way you're describing. The fantastic part about Power BI is like, it's just like, hey, click a few buttons and throw this thing, and I'll take care of it for you. Right? But under the covers, that's what it's doing. Right? So like to triage and figure out and do these things,
super helpful.
It is super helpful. There was a comment earlier, and I don't want to derail back into licensing, but I do believe the advanced incremental refresh is premium only because it requires the capacity. So it's not going to work for PPU. PPU is feature only, and I think you need the full premium.
No,
I think I have a PPU
wrong, but I have in my mind.
I have a PPU running right now with incremental refresh.
This would be.
You get it.
Would be one of those distinctions I would say would have been a great place to make that, because
yes, correct.
It is on the capacity on the back end that you're technically rolling with. But I guess if they have it working with Pro, it's already working.
Correct.
It's just a visibility thing. So maybe that's where it goes into like it's a feature.
Yes, maybe.
It's interesting to me though.
Yeah, so I'm right now, I have a premium per user workspace for a client where we're doing this. We're doing incremental refresh on it, and I can see the XML endpoint.
You do it in PPU.
And I do it in premium per user. Yes, correct.
Well, I mean, if Gold is Pro, then this has to be.
Stand corrected. That doesn't make sense.
Well, you don't get visibility, right? So you don't get the visibility to the endpoint because you're with on Pro. Yeah. On premium per user, you get
visibility to the endpoint.
Yes, you get a full XML endpoint when you're on premium per user. So you can. So another thing to check out here. So Okay.
That's crazy then.
Well, here we go. Let's blow your minds. Okay. So
Please do.
I think this is cool because when you start linking up resource groups or workspaces to the Azure resource group, okay, I'm gonna propose a situation. You haven't done the exact testing on this.
Now we're here. We go.
We're
Here's Mike's dovetail.
Speculating. Words, Michael. Words.
Speculation.
Speculation.
Spackling.
So spackling.
Let me spackle for you.
So I'm getting excited now. I'm sorry. This is where things get really interesting to me. You could actually have a premium per user workspace where you spin up a model, you do the incremental refresh, you look at the endpoint, you can then hydrate all the data inside that data model. Now, with the feature set here, is you can go into Azure, link Azure Blob Storage to that account, that workspace, and then you have the ability of backing up that data model. So this means you can go into a data model, you can incrementally load a lot of data, and then you can take a full backup of it, gigs of data. I'm talking models that are like, 20 gigs and larger. You can take a backup of that into an ABK file, and it stores it in the blob storage. ABF, thank you. And then that ABF file can be transported between blob workspaces, because every time you attach a workspace, now I don't know if this is a premium only feature in Pro, but I think you can still take a Pro account workspace and you could move that data model, that backed up data model, over to the Pro workspace, and then you can restore that model from backup. Now, there are limitations as far as Pro accounts and how big the models can be, but you have the ability of taking these like larger loads in different workspaces and moving the information between different environments. So another scenario here was we built a model in test. So we're using deployment pipelines. I built a model in test. I ran, that one is on a different workspace premium capacity. I can see the endpoint. I loaded up a bunch of data, made sure everything worked fine. I went over to the Pro or the production environment, which was just a Pro account because we're sharing things with other people. And I brought the data over from test and restored from backup into Pro. And I think it all worked. I think I was able to load more data. Now, again, there's still Pro limits thresholds, but you can do that.
This is a little bit more of a teaser to kind of the walkthrough that Mike and I are going to put out for this, because we vetted this. But what does this mean for you in incremental refresh, right? Well, if you know or use incremental refresh on a large model, one of the biggest pains that you have is, oh crap, I made a core change, I need to go redeploy the model, right? And this is usually an exercise that takes anywhere from 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours, right? Depending on how large your model and how far back your partitions you need to hydrate, etc. So with this new functionality that allows us to back up and restore models on the lake, one, it's extremely fast. Like one of my compressed models at like 13 or 14 gig right now took like 5 minutes to back up. It takes seconds to move in storage, and literal like a couple minutes to push into a new workspace. So the value here is we now have vetted out a way in which you can load, like do the full load behind the scenes, load up a model during your work days, and when it's done, basically swap it with production. So you don't have to have weekend time or late night time where if you have to refresh something,
you got to watch
my
it,
team
baby
is
it.
super thrilled, because if we were doing a hot fix during a week, somebody was staying up till early hours of the morning just refreshing partitions.
You did that. You were doing that.
Well, and or on Friday, like on weekends, right? You need to do big things. Now you can do that all on the side, and then just using backup and restore in ADLS with your workspaces amazingly fast. So we've vetted this out and proven it. So like you can expect a blog and video.
There's more truth
podcast.
More truth is for sure coming.
More truth bombs coming.
I think that's March's
maybe
group.
well maybe we'll do it all. We'll just
do it all.
We'll do a blog, a video, and we'll user group it.
Love it.
Yes, I think this is going to make sense.
So you did actually raise a very good point though about like incremental refresh is awesome, but there are, I'm not going to say threats, but there are, in a sense,
when to use it.
Need to be when to use it and things to be aware of. For example, I think the one, and I don't want to say issue, but The one problem is if you are making constant changes to the query, then obviously you have to refresh the whole model. So this is correct.
Okay, so someone who's brought up this one, so there's a couple notes here that there's some capability to handle this, and we actually didn't touch on hybrid tables. I'm gonna make a note here that we'll come back
for the average user.
Yeah, let's talk on hybrid. Let me make a note here. Hybrid tables. We'll come back to that. We want to talk about that one too. All right, Tommy, to your point. So there's someone asked a question that said, what happens when you have updated records in those historical partitions, right? So a couple things to note here, right?
I'm not even saying updated records.
Well, you're saying you added a column.
I'm editing the queries.
Well, one, you shouldn't be doing that.
If you're but ultimately it's the same thing. You're changing the output.
Yeah, you're changing output.
Yeah.
So if something changes, so these partitions are not always loaded every day, right? So there's a concept of, I've loaded data from December, right? Someone may have gone back in and updated some records from there. There is certain data sources where there's no updates to historical records. It just kind of is what it is and it's done. Customer master data or master product information data, that stuff updates all the time. And so how do you handle updates for those kind of things? So what I'll point out here is there's a number of really interesting patterns you can use to do incremental refreshing. Phil Seligmark has a number of blogs around creative ags, it's like aggregation things. Maybe not necessarily incremental refresh, but you can glean some insight from that. So Power BI Incremental Refresh has a feature called look for updated records. So to this effect, let's say you have partitions by day from December through January, okay? Something in something in December changed, right? So that one partition for December now needs to be updated. What incremental refresh policies do is every time the partition was refreshed, it gets a date timestamp of when that partition was refreshed. So what this does is when you set up this check for updates, you need to provide a new column, typically one called updated record column, updated date. So what happens is a query will run the month of December looking for the max value of updated dates. If the max value update date is larger than the partition's last refresh date, you know the data has changed in that partition. So then Power BI says, oh, wait a minute, someone made an update to this partition, therefore I need to go back and load the month of December. So you can still use Power BI incremental refresh, but if you turn on the look for changed records or look for updated record setting, I don't know exactly the syntax of that. What that's technically doing is it's going back through all of your old partitions, and when you click refresh, it will make a single query to go find what is the maxed update date in every single partition. And then it does a check to say, did the update date and or the partition refresh date time, are they different? If they're different, then it knows, oh, this thing's stale, I gotta go fix it and update it. So it will detect changes to your data every single time you do refresh.
If you're tracking changes to your data in the source.
And right? that's a big if. You need an updated date record, and you need a data source that has an updated date record that is accurate, right? If you actually update data and you don't update the field called updated date, you're not going to get the change. So just be mindful that has to be in your source system when you're talking about that.
Well, but that's different than actually editing the M query, though. Like if you update,
dude, you're not editing M. If you're doing incremental refresh, it should be 2 or 3 steps only. That's it. You should be going to the source. You should be applying your filter, and that's it. You want to do everything in a view upstream. You're not writing a bunch of M to do incremental refresh. And if you are, I think you're at risk for headaches, in my opinion here.
And so I think that those are the kind of the segue is, does everyone need to use incremental refresh? Like obviously there's a lot of benefits. Yeah.
I would say so.
I'll let you guys argue. Oh, there you go.
No. Why would you need to setting up incremental, like we just talked about, if you have a pro in setting up incremental refresh without all of the access that you're talking about.
A
lot of the value that we're talking, right, is we can go connect to these models. We can go look at the partitions. We can go refresh those things. What I would say is a good next step for people who want to increase. It depends on your model size, man. One.
True.
Second,
I would agree with that.
A good first step is get off default where you're just hammering all queries on a data source at the same time. And if you want to increment them and execute them sequentially, you can just set a property in your PBIX.
Yep.
That will reduce the load on source systems. If you have long refresh times, large volumes
That's
of
what I'd go
data,
for. Yeah.
then yes, incremental refresh, even on Pro, would probably be a good starting point. I think you're quickly going to move into the realm of wanting the advanced, right? So I don't know if that's PPU, but now you've PPU'd everybody.
Yeah.
At least how much PPUing can we say? Versus premium, right?
Yes.
Where it's much simpler to just manage that environment. And I understand it's more expensive, but living in premium land, I get to I get to be cavalier with my words, right?
So Joe
that's the progression I would do.
Joe from the chats asks, what would you consider a long refresh time? I would say 15 to 30 minutes is a long refresh time. That's when we're starting to get long. And large table sizes, when I'm starting to look at this, million records or more, maybe even a little bit less, maybe 500,000 or more is where I would start really seriously considering. So if that query can't hit you that data and give you that whole table at 500,000 records in less than a couple minutes, I'm probably going to start looking at what do we need to do to incremental refresh this thing.
Even on incremental refresh, my refreshers are typically hours. So
you got a lot of data.
I don't think you can. To me, it's not how long it takes. To me, is do you have a time constraint, and do you need to refresh in a time window, and are you missing that window because it's taking too long? One, and the secondary concern would be, are you overtaxing your systems?
Yes.
If you're overtaxing, try sequential. If that's not going to work, then the next logical step is, how do you reduce the amount of data you're pulling from that system? And incremental refresh is a fantastic way to do that, right? Like the owners of that database or the owner of those systems, especially if they're production or some other sources, are going to love the fact that you went on incremental refresh, because pulling 10,000 records versus the
10 million.
10 million
Yes.
every
Way
day.
better.
Or I would say, if your refresh cadence is also extremely high and not just daily,
agreed.
That's another fantastic reason to get into this, and also potentially a cost
Saving
discussion with your business to push you into premium, because you have to work with the people who own the data if you don't, and say, hey, would it be great if I took these 5 reports I have that are hammering your system every hour and even that loadout? They would probably say absolutely.
Yes, exactly right. And so a couple points here, I think, from stuff in the chat here about the numbers and the refresh time. So I guess maybe I'm tainted now a little bit, because a lot of the stuff that I'm working with, the data sets that I'm working with, are larger data sets, and almost all the time I'm taking data sets that would take hours to refresh down to minutes to refresh on incremental refresh, right? That first refresh is quite long and intensive, but most of my stuff is dropping substantially in time. And I think, Seth, you're talking about models that are refreshing that take hours already. You would never be able to refresh that model. There would be not enough time. You'd be refreshing for the whole day if you did the whole table all the time. So it's just not even feasible in your spectrum. So I definitely think it's worthwhile exploring there. I don't want to transition too fast here. Any other final thoughts on this one? Because I want to talk about hybrid tables and some kind of special case scenarios around incremental refresh too.
You want to talk about special cases? We'll leave that one to there, because I have a few places that I haven't figured out that have gone awry trying to use incremental refresh.
Okay,
so we can do that after your hybrid.
Okay, sounds good. So let's explain hybrid tables real quick. So I'm going to transition just slightly here. Chat, you've been great. If there's any more questions in chat, please throw them in there. We'll try to address them as we go through here. So hybrid tables, what are they? What are those? I guess is what you would say. The hybrid table is really around mixing and matching multiple data loading types. Right. So imagine you have now a table, right? And we have a table that has incremental refresh policy on it. But we need data that is a bit more real time. So you have this concept of, I could do direct query, and direct query will give me data right now. If the SQL Server updates, I can click a button or click a visual on the page. It will automatically go back to that table and grab the latest data. So a hybrid table mixes and matches incremental refresh with the refresh policy. So every day you can schedule a refresh on it, as well as for the current day, today's date, the one that's not finished, you can direct query today's data. So what this gives you is it gives you the speed of an import from yesterday and older, and it gives you here's the data right now based on the direct query. So you can actually have live data in your report. And so what will happen is it will break the query into two pieces. And if you're querying against the data model and there's a time-bound principle to it, let's imagine we have a line chart, right? On the line chart, any data points yesterday and older would come from the import portion of the table. The data points on that table for today would come from the today direct query portion of that hybrid table. So it's actually mixing and matching incremental refresh and direct query together to give you a real-time look at the data, but we know the speed of the analysis services engine is in import mode, right? So if you're using direct query across a year's worth of data, your SQL server has to be incredibly well-tuned and optimized to be able to render that data quickly enough that the report user is not like, this thing takes forever. This is junk. Now you're like in Tableau land where everything takes forever for anything to load.
Well, that's one of those definite, like, communicate to the end user.
Yes.
Expect fast response times when you're
Data's,
playing in this date range.
exactly.
But when you go outside those bounds, all bets
Slower.
are off, buddy.
Yep.
Like click the button and come back later.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So that's really what the essence of a hybrid table is. The hybrid table is allowing you to mix and match those. And I designed a solution for a customer. So one of the downsides of hybrid tables, and I don't know if it's there yet, but we'll see what happens. Inside this hybrid mode, I believe the cutoff date, because of the partition schema that's made for the historical, and I got to do a little more testing on this. When you hit refresh, right? If I refresh in the morning, it's only loading full partitions yesterday and older. So today's data, as today, let's say I have 3 refreshes, 6 a.m., noon, and 5 p.m., right? As I refresh the model, the imported tables are still yesterday and older every time you do the refresh. The direct query portion will only direct query things from today. So what I built for the client is actually I built 2 tables. I built 2 tables where there was an import table and a direct query table. And if you do an incremental refresh and turn on don't load full days of data, you can actually get portions of imported data throughout your day. So you could get from midnight to 6 a.m. in the import table, and then 6 a.m. till noon in the import table, and then you could get from midnight till 5 p.m. in the import table by having this kind of technique. Now you can have those 2 tables in the same data model, but now you have to have like a dimension across the top of it that lets you be able to aggregate 2 measures across it, and then you have to kind of pick, okay, what is the time frame we're looking at, and which measure should I be using? Because you don't want to add the measures. You want to do if the time range is within this certain range, then go to the import table. It adds a little bit more weight to how you write your measures, but we were able to get the direct query down to hourly refreshes throughout the day. So direct query was only hitting the last hour of data, and all of the imports were happening every hour, and it was continually refreshing the current data for the day every hour, so that way all that information was fresh and super fast. So that was kind of a technique I used. It's a derivation of what hybrid tables actually does for you. Out of the box, no extra coding, no fancy measures. It just works.
One point, I know we're wrapping up on time. One point I want to make that we have run into, I haven't solved for. So if anybody in the chat knows how to, that'd be great. We have a scenario where whether it's 2 different queries or something we tried to load into a table in 2 different ways, where in scenario 1, I need 7 days of refreshed partition data. And in scenario 2 in the same table, I need 14 days of data I want to store in there. If you try to merge those 2 together into the same fact table, what ends up happening is, whether it's from a source table or not, if my incremental refresh time window is only the first or second days, inevitably what happens is scenario 1 of 7 days will still incrementally load all the way to 14.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if I'm not explaining myself well, like, essentially, because partitions are historical tracking, you can't, or I'm struggling with, how do you maintain for one data set in the fact table a smaller partition or refresh window, because when you're talking about volumes of data, you have to I'm trying to keep the size of that fact table limited down to a certain size, and there's only certain scenarios where I want a longer tail on that history.
Yep.
Now, the only way that I think this is going to work is we're just going to have to refresh, like kick off an automated refresh of that
Single
8th
partition.
day partition,
Yeah.
right? So that it goes from the higher volume down to the lower one, because I don't want that long tail on all my data. I want it to be trimmed off. And I don't have a solution for that yet, but
Yeah.
it is something to point out that if you have different time windows that you would need for partitions, like straight out of the box, like you're going to have some issues here to figure out as it relates to those tails starting to just continually load as you're only incrementally refreshing the 1 or 2 days.
So there is so to your point exactly, I think you've got the right solution already on there. I believe you can refresh a Power BI data set in Azure using Azure Data Factory, and so there is a way to
we're going down that path.
That's the path you go down. So you basically make a data factory call that's a web call, and you say so. It's
probably going to be an Azure function or something. Where
Yeah.
You're executing.
It's just an API call, I believe.
A SQL, TSML script.
Correct. Yes.
That basically says,
yes,
hey, go refresh this, or kick off a refresh one, right? Because you could also do that.
Yes.
Which we're planning on doing, and then on the tail of that, go behind the scenes, refresh my 8th or whatever day partition.
And I'm pretty sure that it's in the Microsoft blog. It's the one and call it announcing on-demand loading capabilities for large models in Power BI. I think that's what they're talking about there. And I think what happened is there's been an API that's explicitly opened up in the Power BI APIs. You would say, refresh this data set. You say, call that data set. And what you can do is you can actually set in there as the body of the API call, the TSML script that will automatically run the single partition that you need to load. So I think you have the ability of being able to dynamically call out that partition. So you'd need something in your process that kind of does like a, hey, all my normal stuff happens. We've just refreshed the model. Oh, and by the way, we need one extra action at the end of our pipeline that says, oh, by the way, go refresh partition number 8. And that should just automatically happen. I don't think you need a function though. I think it's just an API call now.
Okay.
So I think that's the documentation.
I think we got a hard stop here.
Yeah.
So.
All right, so I think we've talked about almost everything here. One thing last one I want to note here from another tip or trick from Mike. If you're doing this kind of stuff, if you want to see what's happening, there's actually a sequence by which the SQL server or the analysis services is doing a refresh cycle. You want to get your hands on SQL Server Profiler, and so there's a good blog out by Phil Seamark that talks about how you can connect SQL Server Profiler to the cube, and you can turn on a trace. You don't want to do this all the time because it's very expensive on the server to have this trace spitting out information to you, but it gave me a really good picture because when an incremental refresh happens, there's actually a sequence. It starts by making a backup first. It makes a timestamp. Here's a backup of the model in case it needs to roll back. Then it starts to attempt to refresh partitions and do refreshing. It goes through all the process of loading your partitions, and then if it completes, you'll see these commands called commit. It commits those changes back to the data model, and only after it commits the changes back does it actually pull your incremental refresh things into your actual model. So essentially you have a model up and running, and while the incremental refresh is happening, it's doing something internally in the memory of that machine that is not exposed to the reports. It's not there. So it's basically loading a portion of your data model it's duplicating stuff. And then once it's done, it's kind of merging those changes back into your partition schema. So it's pretty cool. I think it's really neat. I would also highly recommend doing some SQL Server Profiler, and I'll try and drop out some links here. So here is the link for the API refresh. That's the new, it's on large data sets. And then I'm going to try and snag the one here, Phil Seamark and his link for the SQL Server Profiler. SQL Server Profiler. All right. We've done it again. We've burned another full hour here. I could talk more on this one. Obviously, this needs to be a user group, a lesson,
yes.
something online. There's so much to I've learned so much in this space in the last month and a half. It's incredible. There's so much
bursting with information.
There's no one talking about it. There's no information on it. No one has good blogs or any kind of content around what is incremental refresh and how do you do stuff with it. So I think I'm gonna have to tool up a little series here around that to kind of get some more people information about it. But with that, we want to say thank you all for participating. We really appreciate your participation. Participation in the chat. That was great questions. Was very helpful to help steer the conversation today. So thank you all very much. We hope you learned a couple neat nuggets here around incremental refresh. I really like these deep technical dive things. This is what I like to talk about. Anyways, I know. That's
why we don't do them as much.
Because we'll always go over. So thank you all very much. Our only ask is if you found value from this, if you're working with incremental refresh, hopefully there's a couple nuggets in here to help you remove some gaps or some hurdles you're going to find. You're going to run into these things. Hopefully we gave you some techniques or tricks around this to make it easier for you to use these things. Please share this with somebody else if you liked it and help them learn a little bit more about what they're doing as well. All right, Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
You can find the podcast anywhere they're available on Apple and Spotify. Make sure to subscribe, leave a rating. If you're listening to the podcast right now, make sure to watch our live events if you can every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. Central.
All right. With that, thank you all very much, and we will see you next week on Tuesday. Cheers, everyone.